Hi, I'm Brett Godfrey, and welcome to ViewPoint. Today's guest, who's been on the show before, is Jeremiah Dalesio. Morning, Jeremiah.
Morning, Brett. How are you today?
It's good to see you this morning, and I'm doing pretty well.
Yeah.
I had a pretty good Thanksgiving. How was yours?
Mine was great. Just simple. Did a lot of cooking, just myself, my wife, my two boys, and
Yeah.
relaxing. And yeah, no complaints.
And how old are your boys?
My oldest is 5. He will turn 6 this Christmas Eve. And then my youngest will turn 3 in this January.
So birthday and Christmas at the same time. I bet he feels cheated every year.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think he's old enough to fully get it yet. But I remember when Lori and I were Lori's my wife, when we were discussing having a family, we said, people asked us or would come up to the conversation of when do you want your kids to be born, right? Because you kind of micromanage everything. And I specifically remember saying, I don't care as long as it's not during Christmas. Well, Christmas Eve, baby. So that was a wild, wild year.
Yeah. Well, I can imagine. The thing is, I grew up knowing kids who had 2 present giving holidays on the same day, and they always felt cheated because they got one present for both holidays, as opposed to some kid whose birthday is in the summer, and
Right.
So he'll get 2 sets of presents every year instead of one.
Yeah, we tried
So-
to make sure it's distinct for him. So it's like this weird schedule where you wake up Christmas Eve but it's not Christmas Eve yet. It's Grayson's birthday, right? And then it's Grayson's birthday until after dinner. And then after dinner, we kind of go into this quick Christmas Eve mode, and we open up stockings Christmas Eve night.
Yeah.
And then it's Christmas morning, right? So I remember, I think it was when he was 2. I remember he started crying Christmas morning because he didn't want to open any more presents, because he had his birthday. He just wanted to go play with his birthday presents, and all this was annoying. So as he gets older, we've kind of talked about, do we do like a half birthday, like celebrate one in June? Because then you can get all the summer presents, right? Because it's also where you're just doubling up on all like the Legos and the indoor stuff, where it's like, where's the skateboards and the baseballs and all that? It's nice to have a date in the summer to kind of do that. So, but that's probably more talk about birthdays than anybody signed up for.
Well, last week on the podcast, I spoke a lot about how to focus your power.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that, and you've since seen the podcast, and one of the things that we had talked about last week was the Serenity Prayer, the Alcoholic's Prayer. And
Yes, sir.
I was talking about the first step of it. But would you do me a favor and
Absolutely.
read that prayer as it's actually written?
Absolutely.
To
This
our
is still
audience?
just the first part, the most commonly known part.
Well, just go ahead and read the whole
The
thing.
whole thing. All right, you're putting me on the spot here. Here we go. All right, so the Serenity Prayer. God, grant me serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference.
So that's a little different than what I did off the top of my head last
Right.
week. But I think what I'd like to do is, based on the conversations you and I have had during the week since the last podcast, is talk more about that.
Yeah.
And, obviously last week, what the thrust of my point from that prayer is to change the things you can. Obviously, you got to know what you can change.
Right.
But the notion of what we were discussing last week was the idea that you can change more than you think you can.
Right.
But just as an aside, I've noticed in this country, we have huge numbers of people that are trying to change things that are really not within their reach or realm.
Mm-hmm.
And they're frustrated constantly,
Right.
whether it's by latching onto an extreme political view or some kind of other social media trend or some whatever's in style for the moment that becomes some kind of avid cause for people.
Mm-hmm.
They're trying to change the world because they're bothered by the world in ways that don't directly affect them. So,
Correct.
for example, at the time we're recording this, it's not been so terribly long since the Kyle Rittenhouse verdict was rendered.
Right.
Half the country, it seems to me, went up in arms over that verdict.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, none of those people saw the trial.
Right.
None of those people saw what the jury saw. And none of those people respect juries in the first place.
And you are a person that you respect juries more than anyone, from my
I
understanding,
am
right?
an advocate of the jury system of justice in the United States. But we've all heard about jury verdicts that we thought were crazy. The most obvious example is the McDonald's coffee lady who spilled coffee in her lap and got a huge verdict against
Mhm.
McDonald's.
That was a big signal in the cultural shift in this
Yeah.
country.
Well, the concept behind that was that there were actually reasons why that jury was motivated to do what they do, but the sound bites are designed to be misleading. Spills coffee in own lap, gets money. That's going to piss anybody off. But
Right.
but the jury that sat through that trial heard an awful lot more about what happened. And none of that is commonly known to the American public because all they hear is the sound bite. And
Right.
Americans think in terms of sound bites. And sound bites are inherently designed to stimulate reactions instead of well thought out responses.
Absolutely. I mean, we've been programmed. I like to say it this way: is somehow I don't know when it began, whether it is a biological mechanism inside of us to just create efficiency, whether it was trained to us in school, but we think two dimensionally in the three dimensional world, right?
Explain what that means.
So we all have these little, very simple responses, right? Let's talk something that you've mentioned many times of gun control on this podcast, right?
Yeah.
Um, I don't think you would find a citizen in this country that thinks that you and I should own a nuclear weapon, right? Nobody thinks that, right?
I'd rather not.
Right, right.
It's too much maintenance.
Gosh, and you might grow a third eye or something with that thing
Yeah.
hanging around, right? And I think you would also find very few people that think nobody inside our entire US border should have a firearm, right? A lot of us kind of clump in the middle of this issue. It's a very complex issue, right? And even you, is a very staunch 2A guy, you actually believe in certain metrics of gun control,
I do.
right? More than probably the standard NRA talking point would, right? But you own as many firearms as probably anybody I know, and you actually are probably better trained than anybody I know, right? Except for maybe an active duty spec ops guy, right? So if we just unpack that one cultural issue, I'm not suggesting that we should, but if you look at that, we look at it a very two-dimensional way of, are you for gun control or are you against gun control? And it's like, yes and no, right? Like, you probably shouldn't own a bazooka. I'm okay with us saying citizens cannot own bazookas, right? And we can walk it back and we can calibrate the conversation to a very intelligent conversation. It's interesting. One specific example, if I were to say, I want to outlaw any firearm that every time you pull the trigger, it releases a round. That's a common thing that you hear. They don't want semi-automatic firearms, right? And to speak the language of semi-automatic, again, to be clear, is every time you pull the trigger, downrange, a projectile launches.
That is right. That is true.
So a lot of people say, yeah, we should ban all those. That's every handgun, right? Like, that's everything but a shotgun.
It's
right?
a lot of handguns.
There are still the double action stuff,
yeah,
right?
where you have to cock on a revolver. There's a certain type of revolver that you have to cock it before you shoot it every time.
But I would say well in excess of 70% of the handguns out there, you just banned.
Yeah.
And then you just say, okay, well, let's start talking calibers. Okay. I mean, basically, and I don't want to get lost in this debate because, again, it's something that you and I really don't have any control of, right? We can have our opinions and we can make our calls to our senators, to our whomever, but really they don't care about us.
Yeah.
Like, it's a joke to even consider that they do. They have their special interests. They have their whatever that they're going to listen to. And unless you're going to donate $10 million to their campaign, you don't matter, right? So, but back to the two-dimensional thinking in the three-dimensional world, if you were to look at anything that's dominated our airwaves in the last 2 years, right? These are very complex things we're talking about, right?
Agreed.
Supreme Court stuff, possible collusion, misinformation, authoritative sources, right?
Fake news,
gun control, What do vaccines do and what don't they do? What does any non-pharmaceutical intervention do and doesn't do? Like, these are all gradations, and we treat them as their switches, right?
I agree.
And I don't know why. Now, you brought what started this thought was you brought up the idea of the soundbite, right? And it's like, is that the symptom or the disease? I don't know, right? We do have a serious attention span problem as a culture, right? With these devices have not seemed to help that at all. And so, and we also feel like we want there's some certain institutions that we collectively, I guess, have agreed to. And if you're accredited by such institutions, you therefore an authority, and you are right and I'm wrong if I disagree with you. Now you're a person that you argue right and wrong in gradations of it every day, right? Every little nuance. So you are attacking complex systems in a complex fashion. The general public does not, and I'm sad, and I'm also, not trying to be fearful, but I'm fearful of what that means to our society long term, right? Because this world is increasingly complex, and we have to meet the challenge, and also we need to, whatever forces that are dividing us, whether it's our own evolution, whether it's external threats from our country, whether it's our internal politicians, we need to find common ground and champion that, right?
I agree with that. Well, my take on politics is that we've got a tradition in this country of always hating the president who's in office.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a honeymoon period. Obviously, I think the news media says it's around 90 or 100 days. And then we start picking apart the flaws of whoever we've elected, which is
Mhm.
really easy if we're a Republican with a Democrat president or vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens, in my opinion, is that Americans are lazy. They vote on a knee jerk basis, they vote the party line,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't really have a say because of the way they waste their votes.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have a say in who the president is.
Mm-hmm.
If more people in this country would stop and really think hard about the candidate that they are going to vote for or choose to support, I think that we would see a lot more fringe candidates moving to the forefront
Mm-hmm.
because people wouldn't be looking for the quick solution. Well, let's see. I think I understand the Republican platform, and so I'm a
Mhm.
Republican because I don't like welfare and I don't like socialism and so on.
Right.
So I'll just vote for whoever the Republican candidate is who seems to have the best choice.
Meanwhile, they're going to expand all these socialist platforms as a Republican.
Yeah, and so the problem with that is that it's like lemmings. The
Mhm.
lemmings are animals that will just all herd off a cliff and
Right.
die because one follows another, and there's nobody actually thinking about where they're going.
Right.
And same way with politics. The idea is that if people were more selective, especially during the primaries,
Absolutely. That's exactly where I was hoping you to go.
yeah, and the point is that we're having, in my opinion, candidates that prove to be unsuccessful or unsatisfactory later have been shunted to the top of the primary list based on a lot of internal deal making. Who's got the most money?
Right.
People used to joke about Donald Trump buying the White House because he
Mhm.
had so much money. But the bottom line is that with Trump and his sound bites, he was better at sound bites than the other candidates were.
Absolutely.
And some of the other candidates were trying to put out concepts that require a thinking person to evaluate, to weigh it, to know
Mhm.
about it. Americans don't want to do that. They want the perfect candidate, but they don't want to stop and think about who they're voting for.
Right, because they've boiled it down to 2D, and I think Trump, the probably the last two elections have illuminated this, but I think we should go back to your previous thought of the primary cycle, right? You have these parties and people inside of these parties, inside the RNC and the DNC, on a local level and a national level, and they're all, let's take the poster child. They're all like Pelosi's, right? She became 100 millionaire in office, right? Like, explain to me how that happens. Explain to me how somebody can acquire that kind of wealth as a public servant. I don't mind you getting paid, right? If you were to tell me Nancy Pelosi's worth $4 million, like, All right, I'm okay with that. 100 millionaire, right? How did that happen? Well, at some point, these people seem to be either, what game are they playing? I think game theory is a fascinating subject that I don't fully understand, but they're obviously in a rent-seeking game. They're in a wealth extraction game. They're not in a public service game. And these are the people running the RNC and the DNC, right? Um, if you look here in Colorado, next year is an election. And if you look of who, obviously Polis is going to be, he's the incumbent. He's going to be represented. If you look at the RNC, who are they actually fielding? Well, it's probably people that have acquired power in interesting areas that are dictating that process, right? But what are their goals? What are their end game? It's not transparent at all. And so then they're putting us in this 2D situation of, do you want right or do you want left, right? When really it's like these conversations should have started long ago. And that's why a voice is like a Tulsi Gabbard really fascinate me, right? Because she kind of rides this weird middle ground. The Democrats hate her. She sued Hillary Clinton for defamation, right? But yet she's a staunch gun control person, right? What is that? That's interesting to me.
Well, that's a matrix of views that person thought through and came up with what they thought was the best overall
And then
set
she
of
gets
policies.
jettisoned by the system.
Yeah, and
Right.
that's because people who think through the complexities of the societal problems we face today have gotten solutions that they either cooked up on their own or in most cases did a lot of conversing with smart people until they came up with what they thought was an optimum
Mhm.
approach. And of course, that optimization of complex solutions as communicated to voters puts people sound asleep.
Mm-hmm.
They get bored. They don't want to pay attention. They don't hold themselves responsible for an intelligent vote decision. And so the sound bites win.
Absolutely. And I think that's where, as a society, and this is, the interesting thought of how it comes back to the serenity prayer. I think as a society, we have to wrestle with this, right? So we're a constitutional republic. So there's certain things our Constitution says these are inalienable rights for you, and the government is here to protect these rights from outside sources, right?
That was the original theory, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should always adhere to that.
I agree.
Which is actually a controversial statement, to say anymore, which is bizarre to me. So we're a constitutional republic, but in order for a constitutional republic to function and survive, it needs an active, educated citizen base, right? And the citizens need to care about this and believe about this and be a part of the process, right? And so what does that look like? That looks like from everything from if your neighbor needs some eggs, to give them some eggs, to also being educated about how you're voting. And if you're an uneducated voter, I never understand the conversations of get out and vote, get out and vote. The message should be, if you at least haven't read the pamphlet, don't vote. You're not doing any good for anyone, right? At least educate yourself. And also, let's educate ourselves on the primaries.
Well, let's
right?
define the word vote.
Okay.
Because I believe that people should get out and vote. And when I was running for office several years ago, I was always peddling that idea, get out and vote.
Mm-hmm.
My definition of vote is think hard about your candidate, pick your candidate with care, and then
So it's
go
a
vote for
more
that candidate.
encompassing definition. It's
Yeah.
not just walk into the ballot box or fill out your thing and put it in the mail.
And vote the party line so that your
Okay.
party tends to pull out.
Which
in
I think
front.
it's a complex, it's a 3D optic on a 2D soundbite, right? Like,
Yeah.
what does the whole word get out? I mean, and that's fun and a very interesting thought, which proves why you talk to juries and why you're a lawyer. Like, what does vote mean, right? And is it just the action of filling out a ballot, or is it the whole process? And I like your thought, like it's the entire process.
And think about the efficiencies of it, because if you have your typical brain dead American voter who decides to go vote the party line, all Democrat, all Republican, whatever, then because they didn't want to put the energy into smart thinking about who to vote for, they'll put in 100 times more energy bitching and moaning.
Absolutely.
And posting social media and trying to undo the election through some kind of after the fact the cattle's already out of the barn. I
Mhm.
mean, it's too late to shut the barn door. The time for all that energy to change the way things turned out is before the election.
Well, also
And how do we get people to do that?
there's this thing of, if you look at the reason of the way politics are the way they are, and my very simple summation of it is influence. The wrong people have influence over our politicians. So
Mhm.
somehow we as citizens need to gain influence back. Now, we can talk about all the ways not to do it. Parting, just voting at the ballot box, whatever side of the column you are on, is not the way to do it, right? But the thing that I found actually in the last few months of these people are actually very willing to have phone calls at certain levels. They're very willing to meet, right?
Yeah.
And then I don't think it's like, I'm going to meet with you. I'm mad at you. I hate everything you're doing. You need to get your act. It's like, let's talk. And that is also, I think, a sophisticated dialogue. Not even sophisticated, a basic dialogue, honestly, with each other, instead of just lobbing shells at each other. There's a phrase I just heard, and I'm drawing a blank on it, but basically it's you find a conclusion and then you draw the evidence to support your conclusion. Right?
Outcome-driven decision making.
Yes, outcome-driven decision making. I want an outcome of X. You want an outcome of Y, and you may have the authority to control this. So I'm going to go in and attack you and explain why outcome X is the best outcome. I'm not going to move you, right? Now, I can win influence with you over a period of time and say, you know what? He's a guy that actually thinks about things, and he at least represents that side well. And over time, you can come together, right? But this show up on November 2nd and decide our future is ridiculous. I mean, if you look at our current president, it's clear there is very large influence behind the scenes there pulling strings, right? Now, we could say that that's probably every president, right? But it's very apparent right now. And I don't want to get into the details of it because I
Sure.
do want to respect the office and respect our country, right?
Which I agree with that. If you don't like Joe Biden, you can say, I don't like Joe Biden's decisions on this and that,
Right.
but he's the president.
And that's a very important thing, that if I had one sound bite to fire to this country, respect and love fellow Americans and disagree with their choices, right? Something like that. Like, love Joe Biden, love him, take care of him, right? And criticize his decisions all you want, right? But we have to create a distinction between those things, because at the end of the day, when we have these solidifying events like 9/11, it wasn't, hey, they attacked Biden or they attacked me. It was like they attacked Americans, right?
Yeah.
Like, we are Americans. Like, and we can, it's a loose definition of what is an American.
And we're
right?
digesting ourselves.
Right. Like, let's go back to taking care of each other. There are clearly forces with megaphones all over the spectrum, and not even just left-right spectrum, just really bizarre spectrums that seem very interested in us disliking each other, or saying you're fill in the blank label, right? And it's like, no, you're an American, right? Now, there are punishments, there are rewards, there are accolades, of course, inside of any civilized society. But I think government and politics is always going to be downstream of society, right? Look at the thing that we've all heard about our whole lives of Roe versus Wade, right? The thing is because our culture has decided abortion is okay, it doesn't matter what the government says, because if the government makes it illegal, it's going to happen. And if the government legalizes it, it's going to happen. It is, right? It's like government saying, don't steal. People that have decided it's okay to steal are going to continue to steal. They always have, they always will, right? But if you have a culture where these things, there's more social penalties for stealing, just like, oh, you know what? Even inside communities where there are criminals, they don't like it. I mean, obviously, I'm talking in almost a caricature format, right?
Well, that's the way we behave.
Right? Like,
we act like cartoon characters.
Absolutely. So if we were to bring some sophisticated thoughts to this and realize that our politics are downstream of our culture, and we need to really work hard, to your point, of what is the vote. The vote actually starts with how culture is, how we engage with our neighbors, how we engage with people on the other side of the aisle, because you may find like one of my historically closest friends sits very extreme on the opposite side of an aisle as I do. And for a while, it torched our friendship. And finally, he actually was the mature one and said, "What is this? What do we got to do to get past this?" And I was like, we're past it. Let's move on. Right now, we have some things that we're not going to get in these really heated conversations. Right. But I know he's a highly intelligent, very articulate, brilliant. He might be the smartest human I've ever met. I have to somehow say that he's come to these conclusions in a reasonable fashion, but that doesn't dismiss my conclusions that I've come to in a reasonable fashion. And maybe there's multiple right answers, right?
Well, that's true. I think when you solve a problem, and we've talked a lot about the anatomy of a problem on
Right.
ViewPoint, you know, a problem is essentially got an anatomy, which is a collision of opposing drives. You know, an intention to do a thing and a counter intention pushing back on it.
Mhm.
And usually you can solve problems simply by making a decision to change that tension or that log jam of thoughts and desires. But if we solve a problem by a knee-jerk decision to resort to some ideology that may have absolutely no applicability to the problem,
Mhm.
then we're insane at that point. That by definition is a total breakdown of analytical thinking. The logic that should go into solving problems in a civilization of intelligent beings should be culturally driven in a direction to think rather than react.
And we should, as a culture, reward people that are thinking, whether they came to the same conclusion to us or not.
Agreed. But one thing I do when I pick a jury in a courtroom,
Okay.
and by the way, for those people in the audience who know nothing about trial work, you don't pick a jury in a civil case. And I'm a civil attorney. I do civil trial work, which is trials that don't involve criminal charges. And I look at potential jurors in a panel that is selected at random from a group of folks that have been summoned by the jury commissioner, and I have so many of them in a courtroom, and it'll vary. That number will vary depending on the.
So they all get the mail, or you need to come to jury
they
duty.
get a jury summons in the mail,
and then there's a panel of whatever.
Yeah, so I walk into court the morning of trial, which is always kind of a heady moment because then you see all these strangers starting to pack the back of the courtroom. And in most courts in the United States, whether it's state or federal, there will be a random selection from that group that's in the audience level, which is called a venere. And we'll pull a certain.
Is that Latin? What is that?
I don't remember what venere means.
Yeah, yeah.
It's the gang
It's
from
the
which.
people. And so
get
there
a
may be 30
smaller
or
group.
40 people there.
Yeah, a venere is often, in a civil case, is often 30 to 40 people.
Okay.
So we'll seat a certain number, maybe it's 18, and then each side gets
So the
4.
number is not standardized?
It depends on the judge's decision making.
Oh, really? Okay.
There's some typical ones, and 18 people is typical in Colorado State Court because then each side is going to have a certain set number.
No, I would think that you'd want an odd number, not an even number.
No, you're going to have an even number of
Okay.
jurors.
Okay.
Remember now, there's no such thing as a split decision with a jury.
It's either all or nothing.
A jury verdict has to be unanimous.
Okay.
So, for example, if I'm a plaintiff, the person who brings the lawsuit, I have a duty.
Plaintiff means to ask.
Yeah,
In
it's
French,
the person.
right?
It's the person doing the suing.
Okay.
And that plaintiff has a burden of convincing the jury of every element of their claim beyond what's called a preponderance of the evidence, which is not the beyond a reasonable doubt standard. A preponderance just means that the jurors find that a proposition has been proven factually more likely than not.
So I hit your iPad with a hammer. You want me to buy you a new iPad. I won't. You take me to civil court. And then if you show an iPad that's been hit by a hammer, you have evidence. It doesn't have to, you don't need the smoking gun of me hitting it. You say, here's the preponderance of evidence. Here's the iPad. It's clearly been stuck with a
Well, and
hammer.
we're on 5 different cameras right now, so yeah.
Yeah.
So you've been. I'll charge you with iPadicide. You know, the senseless murder of an iPad.
So we have, so 18 standard for Colorado State Court. You've got to pick those, or you don't get to pick them. Sorry, I cut
Well,
you.
I have a set number of challenges depending on how large the jury is going to be. And in federal court, the juries are larger than 6. Typically, they're 8 to 10 by federal statute. But the concept is I get so many strikes, and these are called peremptory challenges. And what that means is that once we finish questioning the jurors in the process, which is called voir dire or voir dire, depending on how good your French accent is. I grew up in Wyoming, and in Wyoming they call it voir dire, which is, everybody knows what it means. We don't have to worry about sounding French.
Yeah.
But the concept is I may have 4 peremptory challenges. So I'm
Okay.
looking at a panel that's been selected from the venere, and now they're the ones in the box. And that panel of potential jurors will be whittled down to the size the jury is intended to be by each side exercising these peremptory challenges. And a peremptory challenge is one that you get to use without having to convince anybody that your decision is sound.
Okay.
And that's contrasted from what's called a challenge for cause. And a challenge for cause means I think this particular juror is not qualified to sit on this jury because of some sympathy, bias, or prejudice.
They work
that
for the
they
company
have,
we're suing.
or something like
Yeah.
that, a conflict of interest, whatever. And so I'll convince the judge, if I can, to strike that juror for cause. And I like doing that as a trial lawyer because I don't have to use up my precious peremptory challenges.
You get 4 of those.
Of which I typically will have 4.
Okay.
And that varies depending on how the jury selection process has been structured. But the point is, I'm going to unselect jurors after I've learned about them. And so I'll form conclusions.
But these are still
about-
pretty quick decisions, right? You don't have like
yeah,
2
that's-
weeks to do a.
No, in a civil case, you've never met any of these people, and within an hour and a half, you're striking jurors. So what happens is you strike the jurors that seem to you to be the most disinclined because of the baggage they bring into the courtroom. They're the most disinclined to respond favorably to some part of your case or the case as a whole or to you. And detecting by skilled voir dire questioning which jurors are going to react badly because of what they brought into the courtroom with them is an art. On our firm website, gojolaw.com, we have an 88-page treatise that I wrote on how to pick juries. And I've had lawyers write letters to me from around the country saying that that following the method that I teach, they were able to have a far better jury panel than they used to get. And they've actually attributed my jury selection method with a victory at trial.
So 88 pages. How many years did it take you to get it to the version it is now?
Around 25 or so.
25 of practicing law.
Yeah. And because I started realizing, I grew up with a father who was a famous and phenomenally skilled trial lawyer. And he taught me early that voir dire jury selection is something that if you screw it up, you can never recover. You will not be able to sell your case because you've got somebody on your jury who, under no facts, will he agree to find
And
for
you need consensus.
And it has to be a unanimous verdict. This is why I said earlier there's no split decision with a
Right.
jury. It's got to be unanimous. If the jury can't convince if the plaintiff can't convince that jury of each element of their claim based on a preponderance of the evidence, then eventually they will lose. Now, in theory, the jury is told their verdict must be unanimous, so they tend to either be unanimously for the defense or unanimously for the plaintiff. And that opens up a thing where two outcomes can happen. You'll see a jury with a certain number of people that want to vote for the plaintiff and some folks that will never vote for the plaintiff. And after a while, they decide that this is not solvable. And they'll come as a group to the decision that the plaintiff has failed to unanimously convince the jury, and then they'll just render a defense verdict. The other thing that happens, especially if you signal to them that this is an option in voir dire, I have a series of questions I ask, which I loosely call planting the hanger. So I can hang a jury because I have them understand if you can't agree unanimously, then at that point you may not be able to reach any verdict.
Mm-hmm.
And, good use of that was made by Johnny Cochran in the O.J. Simpson case where he said, your verdict, if you're able to reach one, should be based on blah, 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 blah. But he threw that little clause out there, like you may not be able to find a verdict unanimously.
Right.
So the concept behind that was to tell people, look, if you've got a holdout and the holdout stays as a holdout, you've got an inability to reach a verdict. And
And a
that's
holdout is just a person that will not come to a conclusion.
no, it's a person that will not join the majority.
Okay.
So let's say most of the jurors want to find for the defendant or the plaintiff. And you've got somebody who says, no, I'm on the opposite side of that, and I'm not budging.
Okay.
And so the trick, if you want to plant hangers during voir dire, is to ask people questions like, nobody knows you better than you know yourself. If you found yourself outnumbered in the jury room 11-1 or 5-1, would you yield an honestly held conviction just to be getting along with people?
So you kind of give them a little hero's narrative there.
And and then they say, I would just give in or whatever. And then you run the dialogue a certain direction. You have some time sensitivity here because you don't have that much time, but then you've made it clear that a person shouldn't give in on an honestly held conviction. And there's a type of case.
But if you're the plaintiff, you're probably not running the script, right?
I'm not doing this if I'm a plaintiff.
Yeah.
Because the last thing I want is a hung jury. But a defense verdict and a hung jury are functionally very similar because you don't get a plaintiff's verdict.
So if you're the defense attorney, if you get a verdict in favor of the defense, that counts as a win in your personal tally sheet.
If I'm a defense lawyer and I'm
if you get a hanger, do you still count that as a win in your personal tally?
We joke in the office and say that's the same thing as a defense verdict coupled with a new assignment, because now you have to retry the case.
Yeah.
And that kind of talk is why people don't like lawyers. But the bottom line
All
is
of our industries have these dirty little underbellies to them. It's just the practicality of the industry.
Yeah, but the point is that if I'm a defense lawyer and I hung a jury, then by definition, that was a jury that was otherwise going to vote against the defendant.
Okay,
right?
Yeah.
In all likelihood. That's not a certainty,
Mhm.
but it's a probability. So I'd rather have that hung jury than a verdict for the plaintiff when I'm defending. But when I'm the plaintiff, I've got the burden of proof on my claims, and I have to convince people unanimously. So the last thing I want to do is have a holdout defense juror.
Right.
So I will not plant that hanger. And it's interesting to me how many trial lawyers don't understand things like that about the mechanics of picking juries. But going back to the original point, if I'm looking at a juror, I want to know how they react to things. Let's say I have a minority witness and I've got an all-white jury, and perhaps I have a black witness or a black client. And I want to find out who's going to vote against him just because they hate black people. And I have to find that out because nobody will admit that in voir dire. I have to use a lot of subtle cues to try to anticipate whether they're going to do that. But it got much easier for me when I started asking myself, why do people react the way they do?
Okay.
Why do people choose to believe what they choose to believe? So going back to the political scenario that we were talking about earlier, you've got people that were diehard Trump fans, and obviously you had a majority of voters who voted for Biden. Why? Why did they choose to believe that? I thought both of those candidates were terrible.
Right.
That's just my personal opinion. Neither one of those guys should have been on the final ballot.
Right.
For reasons that I think are obvious to at least half the listeners, depending on which candidate you're thinking about. They were both terrible. And there are people in this country that could be phenomenal presidents.
For sure.
But why do people choose to believe what they choose to believe? They choose to believe, if they're a Democrat, that the smart people at the top of the Democratic Party will make better decisions than they do. It's their duty to just follow and enforce that party line. Same way with the Republicans. I don't care if the listeners are Democrats or Republicans, they may have done this. In fact, probably they did.
Right.
So why? The why is the key to it. Why do people choose to subscribe to belief systems that they don't even fully understand?
Well, and then there's another interesting article I came across. It was over a year ago. And so these percentages are probably not accurate, but never let the truth get in the way of a good story kind of vibe. with a certain amount of certainty, like let's say 80%, they were able to tell your political affiliation by your facial structure.
So what?
They could take a picture and run it through an algorithm.
Who's they?
The researchers behind the study.
Okay.
So I assume it was a university. Not entirely sure. This is an old memory. So sorry, I'm not very clear here. You'd rip me apart if I was on the stand right now, right? But they were able to say, here's a picture, and the algorithm was able to say, you lean this way or this way. And where I'm going with that is there's an old saying that I love, Hispanic saying of the dirt is in the blood, which is kind of where you came from, where you're raised is a part of you, right? You have zero control of this, right? So there is a certain degree of, I think, humility that we need to all have. To your point, why do you believe the way you do? Right? We all will go back and espouse how I did the research and I came to these conclusions and I, read John Locke or I read the Federalist Papers and you may have just been born into it.
Yeah.
Like that's the really creepy thing. And that also goes back to the serenity prayer. The wisdom to accept the things I can't change and the courage, right?
To change the ones I can.
Right. And it's like, but I think you have to have bring a lot of humility to the table, which I think that's why it's a prayer. Because if you're going to pray something, you're instantly humbling yourself to something greater than yourself. That's your belief,
true.
Right?
Absolutely.
So you have to have humility of like, help me know the difference between these two things, right? Because you could rip apart any conclusion and run. We like to talk about randomized control trials, right?
In human clinical trials.
Yeah. And actually, if you look
the drug approval process,
drug approval process, but even I remember was it 6th grade science class or whatever, right? You have to have a control arm to any experiment, right? To know if your conclusion's real or not.
You have to have what I call a stable datum.
Stable datum, right? So then if you do that across anything, you will start to discover like, oh, wow, this system worked in this way and this thought worked in this way. Like no matter which side if you're sober minded and you lean right, you have to look back at the left has done some things right, better than the right would have. And I think if you sit on the left and if you're sober minded, you have to look back and say, the right has done this actually might be a better outcome than we would have achieved, right? You have to have that humility and sober mind, be able to say these are complex systems. They have to have complex solutions, right? There's no just quick way of, we went no carbon, so put a bunch of solar panels up. Like it doesn't work, right? These are complex problems, right?
Well, the concept, I think that you go to the bedrock of why people choose what they choose. It's because they have decided either intentionally or subconsciously to allow themselves to be driven by soundbites.
Yeah.
Why? Because they don't want to take the time to read in depth. You mentioned the Federalist Papers. When I was in constitutional law as a first-year law student, we were required to not just read the Federalist Papers, but we tore them apart. We dissected point by point. I had an amazing constitutional law professor by the name of John Eidsmoe, and he pushed us. He challenged us intellectually. But you go to law school. I got a degree in chemical engineering, and then I went to law school. And so reading hard things, long, hard things, was a skill I simply had to develop to get where I am now.
Mm-hmm.
But the average American has zero interest in doing that.
For sure. There is culturally, I don't know why, but there is I
think it's because the way they were educated as young people. Our education system in this country is so out of whack. It's tragic.
I would very much agree. And with that, it's interesting because what do we do, right? I mean, because on the two sides of the education system, I like the idea of, let's boil it down to very simple points for the idea of keep this inside of an easy conversation, a podcast. So I love the idea of a neighborhood school, right? I think it's a beautiful idea. Your neighbors go to the school, the teachers, the principal, right? Okay, but now in order to have a neighborhood school, you have to have a governing body dictating curriculum,
The
dictating
school board.
testing, right? And then there's state levels above that, and there's federal levels above that,
Yeah.
right? And it's like, so you're gonna, and the thing that's happened is I will make a statement. I will say one Elon Musk is worth 50,000 standard citizens, right? Because of what it does for our society.
Ayn Rand would agree with you.
She would, yes, yes. I feel like our education system is not built to create Elon Musks. It's built to make the average student
Well,
comfortable.
look at where Elon was educated.
South Africa and then Cornell, right?
No, I think he went to Cambridge.
Cambridge, okay.
I could be wrong.
I thought he was. Let's look that up because I thought he was educated.
The point is, he was educated outside the United States.
I'm really curious. Well, I think his college was here.
He grew up in South Africa.
Correct. And I think he came here for college.
I can't remember if it was Joburg or Cape Town or some such place, but his elementary school education, which to me is the thing that is the most important. Because if you educate kids well in elementary school, they're going to do better in high school. And if you educate them well in high school, depending on how well you do that alone, you may end up with an educated American.
Absolutely. So he started at Queen's University. Then he went to University of Pennsylvania. And then he was in Stanford at some point in there.
So all of his college was U.S.
Yeah, I mean, Queen's University. Where is that? I assume that's a South African. Oh, that's in Ontario. That's Canada. That's right. He spent a hot minute in Canada. So he came to North America for his secondary education, right? Which I would say at that moment, to your point, like he could have gone to community college and do what he's done because of what he was already at that point in time, right? Does that make sense? Yeah.
So let's start at the beginning. The beginning of the education of an American is, candidly, I don't think there's a whole lot of education in kindergarten, but
I have a kindergarten right now. I know the curriculum. So
first grade through sixth grade, those are precious, precious years. And we're using our elementary schools as nothing more than daycare. We're not terribly concerned about how disciplined the habits of a student are forged to be. And so that by the time they get out of sixth grade, they really have some discipline and they know what school is.
Yeah, I think it's even more insidious than that, to be honest, right? Because when you start to peel back these layers, educators will throw out some statistics. Like if a child is not on reading level by grade 3, there's like an 80% chance that they will never be, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
That's my point.
But here's the thing that I find unique about that. If you look at, so then all of a sudden they've made this entire push to make sure everybody is at that benchmark, right? Meanwhile, you have the top 20, 30, 40% of that class sitting there bored because it's about elevating. Talk to any educator. Where do they spend their time? They spend their time with either the behavioral problems or the low students inside the class, right? They're not spending their time with the top students. They're not spending their time with Elons, right? They're spending their time with the other. And I think you go back 40 years ago, this was not the case, right?
I agree with you.
It was funny. I've recently had I've had a lot of conversations with my local school district, from the board president to the district superintendent to my child's principal, just some things that are happening. And I was on a call with my district superintendent, great guy. He and I disagree on some things, but great dude. He's a leader. He's the real deal, right? But he brought out this thing of like, I think our kids are so well educated. They're better educated than any of us would have ever been. Any of us were. I was like, well, that's a pretty bold statement because we sent a man to the moon and split an atom with a slide rule. Those people were smart. Those people were really smart. Do you think anybody we have is capable of that kind of ROI on the tools they have?
I think the smartest people in the country today, defining smart as a combination of intelligence, native intelligence, plus education, plus training. But the most productive and the most brilliant minds in America are more powerful today than they've ever been in the history of this country. It's not the upper echelon I'm worried
Right.
about. There's not enough of them to change the outcome of an election.
Right.
Other than by trying to buy influence.
Right.
But if we focus on the average American is still a pretty smart person,
Oh yeah. Especially if
and
you look at it by historical standards.
but they tend to act really stupid. We've got a huge, hundreds of millions of people in this country who are really smart people that chronically act really stupid.
Well, I think again, it goes back to the educational pieces of it. Go back to the educational system, and I'm not even suggesting it's a conspiracy or anything like that, right? Like, I hope nobody hears that. I think we've found the easiest solutions rather than the best solutions, and I also think if you look at the system, um, we're not teaching our children to challenge anything, right? And I think in order to have a robust knowledge, we have to be able to challenge the common narrative, right? A sixth grader is not taught that they can. Now I'm saying it has to be taught because it's not just, hey, just disrespect your teacher, disrespect the authority. I'm not suggesting that. But at a certain point, like we were all taught growing up certain specific things about science that turned out to be untrue. But if we pushed back, i.e., a very base example would be Pluto. I was taught I had a test how many planets are in the solar system, MVMJ right? Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto. I got good grade. That fact is not a fact, right? Because now if I were to say that, I would get a bad grade, right? But
because Pluto's a planetoid or a planetesimal or
yeah, it's
some
not a
such
planet
thing?
anymore, right?
Okay.
Now also, if you say mathematically, there's probably another planet out there. We don't know. We've never detected it. But the math says there's another planet. We don't know about it. But what we do and we don't, right? So if some student were to come to their science test and say, well, it's Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus,
Neptune,
and unknown, are they going to get a good or bad grade? Right? I would hope the teacher would reward them with a good grade of like, yeah, we don't know.
Well, that's the problem is that the teachers don't know what they're teaching. When I was in third grade, I lived close to a library and I had very, very literate parents. And I fell in love with libraries when I was in first grade. I was a fluent reader in first grade because I had some babysitters and plus my dad teaching me to read when I was even pre-kindergarten.
Right.
So by the time I was in first grade, I could read just fine.
And obviously the aptitude for it as well.
Yeah. And we had people learning to sound out, Sam threw the ball.
Right.
And I'm so bored I can't even think straight because I already know how to read. And so I would go to the library and get books. Well, I was fascinated with space stuff because don't you know I'd been exposed to the ultimate mind stimulator, which is Star Trek.
Right.
So I wanted to read about rockets.
And you were driving on Pershing Avenue or whatever every day.
Pershing, yeah,
right?
that's right. Yeah, Pershing, named after
General. Yeah.
So, because I grew up in Cheyenne, but the point is, I went to the library and I got books on rockets and I read them cover to cover. I couldn't put them down. I was fascinated. And I used to be in mourning when I had 2 weeks were up and I had to take the book back.
Yeah.
And frequently I would go in and recheck it out again.
Yeah.
They were pretty nice about letting me do that. But then one day I show up in school for third grade and Mrs. Smith, a 65-year-old Caucasian female who has zero knowledge of anything, is trying to explain how rockets work. So she starts drawing on the board and explaining how rockets work. And it was absolutely
ludicrous.
It had nothing to do with anything.
Right.
So I raised my hand. I said, that's not how rockets work. They work this way. And I wanted to go up to the board and draw it out.
Right.
And she had me go to the principal's office.
Right.
Welcome to life, Godfrey, in small town America. And I was so disturbed by that I just decided that it's me versus the system. So I became an absolute marksmanship with spitwad. I was a better shooter with spitwads than Rob Latham is with bullets, because I would unscrew the barrel of a pen and chew up some paper, and I'd shoot those spitwads, and they would stick. And I could literally plant that spitwad anywhere I wanted on the blackboard, And so every time the teacher turned around, and there's spit wads on the, and I'm shooting from the back row.
Right.
And she's like, "Where's all this coming from?" And I'm thinking, she's too dumb to even realize that somebody's shooting spit wads at her.
Right.
And so that became my personality.
Right.
I became a professional grade troublemaker.
Right.
And obviously I ended up in trouble a lot.
Right.
I spent a lot of my youth grounded.
Yeah.
And I don't mean grounded in a good way. I
No.
mean, go to your room and stay there till you die. So the concept is, how do we fix that?
Right.
How do we take that third grade teacher who doesn't even vaguely understand what they're trying to teach and replace them with somebody who does? Well, the first thing we have to do is raise salaries, raise standards, not for students, for teachers. And I feel so strongly about that. That was my platform when I ran for the Colorado legislature.
And I would also say with that, we've got to get administration under control. So, I mean,
tell me what you mean by that.
So to peer behind the curtain, my wife's a second grade educator, right? So we're talking about this. This isn't my court, right? If you look at how many decisions on a day-to-day basis based upon a rubric and curriculum that my wife or even the regional school is allowed to make is very limited. It's all handed down. And a lot of it's handed down because some states' representative, forget about if they're, left or right, put some well-meaning legislation in place, and then the district has to respond to get their funding to support this legislation. So at no point is a teacher boots on the ground allowed to make any decision, right? They are built to be just robots. The system is building them to be robots, right? I believe in the power of the teacher. I believe in the power of educators. I think as we can all go back in our history and say, man, there was a teacher that inspired me. There was a teacher that saw something in me and turned up the gas on that flame a little bit, right?
Sure.
We have to get more of those. And that's where I think that you start to see this a little bit in charter schools. You start to see this in private schools a little bit more, where it tends to be where these people are gravitating, right? If you look at my wife, highly educated, a master's degree plus educated individual, right? She's smart. And she's also an inside the box individual, right? It's just her DNA, right? Like, she likes the rules. She likes the systems. She's, 1 + 1 = 2. And if you do this, you're going to earn this much, and you're going to retire like this. Like, her personality is drawn towards that, right? So you get those types of personalities inside education with an overactive administration. And then you see oh, the administration just bought a $3 million reading curriculum. They're swapping out 3 years later that is completely to a curriculum that's antithetical to what was in place. What is going on here, right? So I think, yes, raise teacher pay, right? Of course, I think we have to get these districts functioning in a little bit more of a healthy manner, get the administration down, and get our legislative process in check with this, right? Because this No Child Left Behind sounded awesome.
No Child Gets Ahead.
Patriot Act sounded awesome, right? All this stuff sounds awesome. And then you get into, you're like, oh my gosh, this is actually really prohibitive, and also we can't get rid of this stuff.
Well, No Child Left Behind is a soundbite.
Exactly. So that's where it's really complex. Because of course, do you want a child to be left behind? Do you want a child to not be able to read? God, I mean, let's vote for that.
I'm in favor of No Child Left Behind as long as it doesn't slow other kids down.
And that's not the entire, but a good chunk of our educational process. And that's why I think education has become so myopic on a few different views, right? Of what are your math and reading scores, right? When you think of actually, are we building citizens? If all you know how to do is some math and read, are you going to be able to live an effective life? Do you know about emotional maturity? Do you know about debate? Do you know about how to get along with your neighbor? What do you know about? And you look at where a lot of these other lessons are learned, are extracurricular activities, art, music, sports. And what do? We keep cutting that stuff down because we need more of this reading and writing time that it appears is not effective, right? For whatever reason, I don't think and I really don't think it's at the teacher level of these problems. I think it's well above them, of where these problems are. So it's like, I mean,
Well,
COVID's a great
I'm
example.
I'm not saying that the teacher
Oh, I didn't hear
is
that.
causing problems.
I didn't hear you say. I just want to be clear, partially. So in case
I'm
my
just
wife
saying the
listens to
teacher's
this,
not
right,
qualified. We need to replace the teacher
with a different teacher or a different system.
with a different teacher, meaning that the teacher meets higher standards of both education, personality, emotional control, all of that
Yeah.
stuff.
So now you're talking merit,
Now merit,
which
merit,
is like
merit,
game over. Like that's a non-starter in those circles.
But you have to do it. We're never going to fix the system if we don't do that.
Yeah, and I think that because of the 2D, what you've brought up before in this conversation of it's never going to happen.
Well,
right?
Just wait a minute now. Let me finish this.
Yes, sir.
So the second thing is a better delivery of the material.
Okay.
So, for example, if you're going to explain the circulatory system to a bunch of third graders, you could have a teacher who actually understands the circulatory system. Or, and P.S., I don't care how good that teacher is at explaining the circulatory system, they are never going to touch Hemo the Magnificent, which is a movie that we saw in third grade. It's a 45-minute, it was a 16-millimeter film, and the class AV geek, me, would put it up on the projector, and then we watched this. And 45 minutes later, I have an excellent understanding of the human circulatory system. Somebody spent a lot of time and money putting that,
for sure,
that film together. So I'm a huge believer in higher quality teachers, but also better packaged delivery.
Absolutely.
I am learning several different new skills now. I'm messing around with a guitar. I'm trying to learn how to speed solve the Rubik's Cube.
Right.
I'm basically a self-taught painter, et cetera, et cetera. And I learn a lot of things online.
Right.
There's a million different ways. YouTube has by itself tons of really beautifully packaged informational stuff. LinkedIn Learning is a super weapon. It's an atomic bomb for anyone who's interested in learning new skills.
Masterclass is awesome.
Masterclass, Khan Academy, all that stuff. But, the concept is that if we had better teachers and there was a well-selected curriculum of audio-visual presentations that would replace just droning on a given day, and that creates some standardization, but it also keeps the interest level high because you have better graphics. You've got an entertaining delivery that is structured to make it easy to remember what you've learned. More of that with better teachers. Now we're only missing one last thing. And I'm not putting one of these ahead of any of the others. There's three things. The third thing is, what is mom and dad saying? Is there even mom and dad?
Right.
How many kids are growing up in a single parent household?
Right.
But whoever the parent is or are they instilling a sense of respect, discipline, ambition, competence, confidence in their child? Are they doing their side of the job? Because we can't expect school teachers at the elementary level to do that. They're not parents, they're teachers.
Correct. And
so the kid needs both. He needs the right teacher.
And if you're going to pick one of the two, you're going to pick the family system.
Well, how do we fix the family? Let's just ignore your school board issues and all that shit and just focus on why are parents today doing, across the board, a pretty piss poor job of raising kids. Now, there's going to be a parent listening to this podcast who's really proud of how they act as a parent, and they'll be offended. I'm not talking to you.
Right.
Whoever you are out there, I am not talking to you. I'm talking to the others who will come back kind of in a petulant, whiny voice and say, well, I'm just barely making ends meet. I'm working 2 jobs.
Right.
And, the baby daddy.
Well, I think let's even
Bolivia.
focus it to the thing that we can talk to directly. Like, if you're a mom, great job. This conversation isn't for you because we're not talking to you.
That's right.
Okay. Mom, you're good. You're good to go. Dads, this job is hard. It's way harder than I ever thought it was going to be. Right?
The job of parenting?
Yes. It is unbelievably hard. It is unbelievably taxing. It is unbelievably humbling, right? This is a very difficult task. But we also know something in the order of 90% plus people that are violent criminals didn't have a dad in the home, right? Like, there is a certain degree that if we just show up, a lot of statistics move in our favor, and we're not. right? You look at the statistics of how many men are absentee fathers just show up, right? We can complain about our school system, we can complain about our politics, but if you're not showing up, these problems will get worse. And if you do show up, I bet you these problems will get better, right?
I
Just
agree.
show up,
Agreed.
right?
Agreed.
And this is not complex stuff, right? And I'm not, and if you are showing up, great, keep showing up and be better. Like I think that some weird things happen in our society when you looked at the evolution of the father. You know, in the 60s, it was kind of like fathers are everything. They're the most important. They can tell their wives what to do. And we realize it's not
Father knows
great.
best.
Right. And father knows best. Not a great posture. Right. But
Good
then
TV show.
yeah. And then, so I mean, there was actually a documentary I saw on TV shows and how it influenced culture, because you go from Father Knows Best, you go to Cosby, forget about everything that's happened since the show's got off the air, but just the actual show itself, there's a highly intelligent, highly articulate, passionate dad that cares about his kids.
Dr. Huxtable.
Right. And that was a compelling, interesting family. Then you start to move into the 90s and you get Al Bundy, right? That's now what we're projecting upon our society of what men are, right? Now, I'm not demonizing anybody, right? But it's just, you start to get like men are buffoons. Women run the household, let women do the thing. And I agree, women should be, they're awesome. Like they are irreplaceable, right? I also think don't be Al Bundy, right? Al Bundy does not raise good kids. It makes a great, hilarious TV show. Now, Al Bundy always worked. He always did some certain things. But if you look at culturally, and I think media is a reflection of society, we shifted too far, right? We went from this father knows best chauvinistic stance, which wasn't great. Instead of evolving that to something that should have been, to probably more of a Dr. Huxtable, to Al Bundy. Okay, we need to have an honest conversation.
We glorify the idiot. You know, the TV show The Office.
Yeah.
I'm the only person in this law firm who didn't think that was a terrific TV
I can't,
show.
no,
I couldn't
agree
stand watching it.
Yeah, I can't do awkward comedy. It's just something
cringeworthy thing.
I can't do it. Like my body feels on fire when I see it. But yeah, I can't do The Office. I can't do, I mean, I'm not slamming the mechanism. I'm not slamming the art. I go for it, right? But there's a certain point that is a reflection upon our society, and we need to move past it. We need to encourage integrity, citizenship, being an autodidact, right?
Now, there's going to be folks in the audience that don't know what
autodidact is. Self-learning,
that mean?
Self-taught. So when you talk about YouTube and learning things, you're being an autodidact, right? It's an autodidactic form. I think as a culture, we need to push that, because this is where the thing of, we have so much pressure on our education system, and I think rightfully so, but to where you beautifully stated earlier, we have more tools, we have more knowledge. And what do? We doom scroll.
Well, I can learn anything on I have my iPad.
Literally
right
anything.
I can learn. You wouldn't believe the things I've learned on an iPad. I learned web design. I learned so many different things. But if you look at how this device is used with children, we use it to hypnotize the kids.
Mm-hmm.
We have a kid with a little too much spark, a little too much energy, a little too much natural curiosity, and we label them hyperactive. Which by itself, so someone is hyperactive. What's wrong with that?
Right.
But we want to either give them a shut up pill, you know, a child's antidepressant, which is all it does is shut kids up, and buy peace and quiet for the parents, or we hypnotize them with a device.
Right.
And so we give them a cell phone, and we don't pay attention to what they're doing on the cell phone, and they tend to gravitate to hypnotic things.
Right.
Twitter is hypnotic.
Right.
Angry
it's built
Birds
to be so, right?
Yeah,
These are they're scientifically designed to give us dopamine hits.
Dopamine hits, exactly right. And for those that don't know, dopamine is a chemical in the brain. It's a neurotransmitter which has the effect of producing a sense of reward for something. And so if you're getting a dopamine hit from a hypnotic app, whether it's Twitter or social media, Instagram, whatever, uh, you have a kid who becomes addicted to cell phones,
Mm-hmm.
screen addiction. What? And so we say, well, let's limit screen time. That is so insane. Let's
Right.
increase screen time, but put quality shit on the screen.
Right. Figure out to engage it properly. Yeah. I I, I absolutely agree with that because most of what I know came from that. I remember so I just turned 40 and I remember when I was in junior high, we got a real computer and we got something called an Encarta. It was a CD that was the entire
Oh, I
encyclopedia.
remember Encarta.
And I remember I would just sit at night and read Encarta, Encarta, Encarta. And then it even had some beginning like animations, like how does an engine work? I can still see it in my brain, right?
Yep.
Of like, here's a piston, or here's a cylinder, and here's a piston, and it shoots air in, and it shoots a combustible material, and then it compresses, and then the spark plug, right?
Yeah.
Like, oh my gosh, right? These are amazing tools. I think we have to have a couple things that we brought up. We have to encourage this, like, hey, go learn something, reward our children for learning, put a reward system, a competitive reward system in place for our kids, right? Like when my child does certain things, he gets stamps. The stamps is an equivalent of $1, and then he loves to go buy Lego sets when he's acquired enough stamps. Like I give him stamps for uh, chores above and beyond his standard chore list, right? Some exercise things, like when he hits achievements of like how far he can ride his bike or how many burpees he can do or whatever, he'll get a stamp, right? And then also academic achievement that can be inside the system or outside of the system, inside of his school system or outside of his school system. Like let's create competitive reward dopamine hits about the values we want, but we have to talk about these things. And then also you brought up,
So let me ask you this.
yeah,
How do we get large masses of Americans to change the way they parent?
show up,
How do we get them to do that?
right? Yeah, oh gosh, I don't know because it's so. I mean, I says, and I don't know. Like I've had these thoughts. I've never actually verbalized them. So I'd be curious what your take on this is.
That's why we have the podcast.
Yeah, what's my viewpoint? Being a parent's an incredibly humbling experience, and there's probably not a day that goes by that I don't feel I don't feel worthy of my kids. I feel like they should have a better father. Than
I've
what I
always
am.
felt that way about myself and my own children.
And so I think when you have that, you talk about oh, what's that book you always repping? Like the opposition's the way, or the
Oh, the Ryan Holiday books.
yeah.
It's the obstacle is
The
the way.
obstacle is the
Ego
way.
is the enemy.
Right. So it's like, I think you're going to get two types of people. The obstacle's the way. I don't feel like I'm a good enough father, but I want to be a better father. So I'm going to fail a lot. I'm going to be humble when I fail. I'm going to attempt to be humble when I fail. I'm still a jerk. Right. And I'm going to try to become a better father tomorrow than I was today. Right. Like, I think you see this culturally a lot of like,
But
I think-
that's you, Jay. How do we get others to think
yeah, and I think
the
there's
same
other
way?
people that shun away. They can't deal with that, and so they either they self-medicate themselves with whatever it is, right? Achievement, career performance, alcohol, food, and we all have our vices, right? So I'm not saying we need to be Puritans, right? Go have your drink, go drink your whiskey, I don't care, right? Go eat your carbs, I don't care, but show up. So how do you? I don't know. How do you encourage the person that the obstacle is the way? Like swallow your humble pill and realize that you're not a great parent and go be better. How do we as a society say
But
this
who's
is the
gonna-
way?
How many people sit down? I was taking a class 2 months ago at Gunsight. I go down there multiple times a year.
Religiously, from my optic.
I love Gunsight.
Yeah,
It's the
there's
fun-
nothing that excites you like that.
No,
place.
it's the finest shooting school in the world, guaranteed. But the one of the teachers, one of the instructors on the range, said he started talking about "Ego is the Enemy" by Ryan Holiday, and I've now read that book twice. And Ryan Holiday's books are "Obstacle is the Way," "Ego is the Enemy."
And you've been on this ego kick for like a year now. It seems like where you're
Stillness is the Key, and Courage is a Calling. I think are the 4 books by Ryan Holiday that I can remember off the top of my head. But to read "Ego is the Enemy," who's going to actually sit down and read that book? The range officer that I was training with, a really brilliant guy and a beautifully skilled martial artist, started talking about it, and I've read all of Holiday's books, but I find that if I turn to the average person, even some really smart people, like I've got the smartest people in the world in this law firm,
Mm-hmm.
and I say go read Ego is the Enemy. Who's going to do that?
Right.
Wouldn't they rather read uh, James Patterson's latest novel or some such thing?
I struggle with that.
Who's going to read a nonfiction self-development book that's hundreds of pages long and do that? Well, they're not trained to read.
Mm-mm.
And learning to read is more than just learning how to sound out words. It's learning how to get past words you don't understand by looking them up before you go further in whatever you're reading. There's an art and science to absorbing written information, especially if it's in a large compilation like a 500-page book. So, you could read Ego is the Enemy by Ryan Holiday, or you could go read Black Sunrise.
Right.
One of those is going to give you loads and loads of instant gratification and entertainment.
Right.
And the other one's going to give you a lot of life-enriching ideas that require discipline to absorb.
And you have to even be willing to institute them. And I think how do we as a society do this? It goes to culture, and how do we bend the cultural narrative from TikTok, dancing chicks or sound bites, to create a cultural movement, and we've seen versions of this like Jocko, clearly, discipline is freedom. Like that was and is a cultural movement.
That is the stuff.
Yeah. And like we need,
he is remarkable.
Yeah. I love Jocko. I love that whole ecosystem of all those thinkers and trying to dial in too much. Basically, I'm not trying to say Joe Rogan because he's so controversial, but I love that whole world. I love those ideas on display, right? Joe Rogan's podcast for me has introduced me to many people, including Jordan Peterson, the Weinstein brothers. Well, all these people were people that when I was introduced to them, I didn't like them because they think differently than me. And I remember specifically with Jordan Peterson and Brett Weinstein, I was like, I don't like this guy. I'm going to go find out why I don't like him. I did all this research, and all of a sudden I was like, these are the real dudes, right? So be exposed to these ideas, have these cultural movements. And I think it's interesting how our society is against Rogan because he'll throw out stupid and controversial topics, but we should be free to discuss those. But I've always wondered, back to the point I was driving to, if we don't have any cultural coordination, right? Like what if certain creators, certain authors, define culture however you want, all said, you know what? We need to make a movement that the obstacle is the way. We need to make a movement that the dads need to show up. Define whatever it is. And then like, you know what, for the next 6 months, Brett, once a month on your podcast, I want you to talk about this. And I want Rogan to talk about it. And I want Jocko to talk about it. And I want a book that supports this to be talked about on all these podcasts, right? I mean, I think that's how you would start to do it, but the coordination isn't there. Right. And how do you do that? I have no clue. Right. I mean, I think if I've learned anything this last year, is actually a lot of people are willing to have a conversation if you initiate it, if you call them. Right. So I think at a certain point, politicians are to a degree. Actually, the hardest person I've had punching through is my state my state senator. One person that won't get on the phone with me. Everybody else will.
Which senator are you referring to?
Oh my gosh. I'll have to think about that.
Brain lock?
Yes, absolutely.
I know how that feels.
Yeah. If you wouldn't have asked me, I would have been able to say his name. And also I've never actually spoken with him. Might be a reason why I'm not recalling his name.
Well, if you had his name, we would say pick up the phone.
For sure.
Especially when Jeremiah Dalesio calls you.
His assistant's very nice. I've talked to her about a half dozen times, right? So back to the point of how do we create coordination? Because what's it? Divide and conquer. We've been divided on a cultural level, right? On a political level, but also on these just societal level of citizenship of how do we encourage better fathers, right? Like, instead we're debating of gender, instead of just saying, can a male type influence show up and can a female type influence show up? Right. I'm not saying you have to go be a sports fan to be a dad. I'm saying, but a figure needs to show up in a child's life that's going to challenge them and push them.
Look over your kid's homework before he turns it in.
Right. Maybe even
help him with his homework.
Right. And don't do things for them, but like help them build the systems into their life of like, hey bud, you got homework this week. When are we going to do that?
When I was in 9th grade, I moved to Cheyenne after living in Denver for several years with my mom. My parents were divorced, and my dad was not an absentee father. He fought tooth and nail with my mom to get more visitation rights and things like that. He wasn't trying to take me away from her, but
he just wanted
to be involved much more so than the court system contemplated with the divorce decree. But and eventually, when I reached the age where a judge said I had a choice, I moved up to Cheyenne to live with my dad again. And I was a D and F student in those days, and all I cared about in the whole world was martial arts. I just wanted to learn to be a better fighter, and that's literally the totality of my existence, was learning to fight better. And I did a lot of fighting. I was getting good at it. My father panicked. He says, "I've got to get that kid out of that environment." So I moved up to live with my dad, and lots of things started happening. But one thing that I'm very proud of is I went through a phase where I was having a brutally difficult time with math, and particularly I'm talking about algebra. So my father would get 2 or 3 legal pads out of the supply section of his office and a huge stack of freshly sharpened pencils, and he would come home at 3:00 in the afternoon. And I maybe have had an assignment, chapter 9, do all the odd problems, the odd numbered problems. And he would say, "Well, we're going to do problem number 1. Now, you take me through it. You solve it for me." And if I got stuck, he would read the chapter, and he could read. My dad actually knew how to read. Definition of read at Godfrey Johnson is you can explain it, you understand it, you can apply it, you'll be able to remember it for a good long period of time. If you can't say those things are true, you haven't read the document. And we teach people how to get to that, with our new people that join the firm. But my dad was able to do all those things. He'd read the chapter, and we'd go through problem number 1. And then he'd say, "All right, now problem number 2. No, Dad, I only have to do the odd numbered problems." And he would look at me over his reading spectacles, and he'd say, "Problem number 2." And so we'd done all the problems. And then I felt cheated. Like I had to do twice as much homework as all the other kids. And, I've been locked up in this den with my dad all afternoon while other kids are out playing. Well, guess what? I got an A in algebra.
And you went on to become a chemical engineer, with last I checked is very math intensive.
There's some math in engineering. You can trust me on that one. But then things came back my way, because then the next day the homework assignment was do all the even problems. I've already done them all. I don't have to do anything today. I've got my homework done. So, I started seeing some wisdom in my dad's methods.
There was something
but he showed up. He came home.
Yeah, there was something that stood out to me of you look at where our mental health issues, where does so much of our problems come? It comes from a state of us feeling alone and overwhelmed.
Agreed.
Right?
Absolutely.
But when a parent's standing there next to you teaching, like, you're not alone. Like, this may suck, right? This may be hard. We're not saying that I can fix that for you, but you're not alone.
They keep you on track.
Right? And maybe that's just a lot of parenting. I think that so many things of life are now there's, certain things that you are an echo chamber about. I know, like my 40s, I've decided it's going to be a decade of learning to listen and learning to deal with failure, learning to accept and be okay with failure, because you're not going to learn if you don't fail. Right. And I've decided that
we learn more from our failures. If we're really trying and we're dedicated, we learn more from our failures than we do from our successes.
And I think so. My toolbox is not sophisticated enough because I've just tried to champion my successes. And whenever I have a failure, I kind of run from it and bury it off in the distance. Right. I think you need to walk up to and own that failure and say, teach me, show me your lessons, failure. Right. And I think that's a parenting. Right. Show up. Support your kids, fail. You're going to fail.
Learn from the failure
Apologize
and go on.
and go on. Be a better parent. And so I think that's the thing of, I guess back to full circle the beginning, the serenity prayer of like I don't know what I can and can't change. I know I need more courage, and I know I need more grace and humility.
You can change how much time you spend with your kids.
Absolutely. Right. And also I can have the courage to fail, right? The courage to show up and fail and succeed and walk alongside them. And I know that if I can do that for my boys, you did that for your daughters, or you can do that for your grandkids at some point, right? Like we can move this ball forward, and we can have all these conversations about education, right? But I do know that when you look overall, not exclusive, is not 100%, but overall, the data on the kids that perform really well in sports and academics that go on to colleges and have these jobs, they have involved parents.
They do.
Right. And so it's like, I mean, you said it's not fair to put all this weight upon these systems. Right now, I think we can rightfully criticize our educational system, right? Have those conversations. But if we're not doing our part, that system can't overcome that.
Imagine how crazy it would be if you had a 9th grade kid and a parent who sat down after dinner with that kid and said, "Who do you think should be the president?" And the parent then says, "How much do you know about that candidate? How much do you know about the other candidate? Let's see if we can't learn more about both of them."
Right.
But not the sound bites, Junior.
Yeah.
What does Donald Trump really believe about X?
When teach your kids a debate, because the last thing I think so many parents want their kids to believe, like I remember it was very clearly to me at Halloween when Trump was still in office, and I was with this other family, and they were like, "Oh, those are Trumpers." The parent clearly, these are young kids that doesn't know what a Trump is, right? Like the parents are indoctrinating their children on this, right? Like teach your kids Socratic methods. Teach your kids to debate you. If your kids do not agree with you ideologically or politically, that actually may be a good thing, right?
Well, his parents named him Trump because they knew they could see the future, that one day he would try to trump the election.
Gosh, the all those.
But I'll be in town all week, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, 6 and 7 in the lounge, right? Yeah, let's encourage our kids to. I've actually had some conversations with my child's principal in the district, right, about how do we. I want my child to be respectful. I want him to be courteous. I want him to care about building a community. And also, I want him to stand up and know when civil disobedience is the right tool. And also, I want the system to give him the grace when he does it poorly and the knowledge to educate him.
But don't you know, the nail that stands out gets pounded down?
Yeah, I guess that comes down to the courage part, right? But
that's
it's
a soundbite.
Oh, absolutely. It is, yeah.
And it's a stupid soundbite.
Yeah, and we're teaching our kids. I've when we were young enough, we were still taught the lesson that if everybody jumped off the bridge, would you? Right? I get it's a soundbite, but it's an interesting question, right?
Well, it is.
No, but that's not a thing anymore.
It doesn't do a damn thing in a conversation because the kid's first reaction is, that would never happen.
Right.
That's a non-applicable metaphor or whatever the hell you're trying to say.
But I've thrown that out in conversation a couple times in these arenas, because what do we want? Is we want a uniform way of being, and that's dictated to us by not even science, by some, I don't even know what's controlling us right now. And how do we respectfully and kindly say, no, thank you, right? Like, I'm not going to threaten you. I'm not going to whatever, but like, this thing isn't a thing. We're not going to play this way, right? I think a populace needs to be a little rowdy, right? I mean, it's the impetus behind 2A, right? It's not so you can stockpile firearms. It's that that base that you're trying to control, they can be a little bit rowdy, right? Like I think Dave Chappelle says it the best I've ever heard it. I love the First Amendment. Freedom of speech is the best thing ever. And the Second Amendment's just in case the first one doesn't work out. Right?
I'm
Like,
with you.
right? Like you need a citizenship that does it respectfully. I'm not saying that don't read into anything I'm saying about 2A, but how do I raise my child to be a leader? Not because he has to be a leader, but to have the tool set that to lead when he needs to. And also sometimes the leader's best tool is to stand aside, right? Um, but to respectfully ask questions and respectfully disagree. And then how do we make sure we have systems in place that encourage that, right? If a child is challenging you, first we have to teach them to do it in a respectful manner, but we should not teach them to not challenge or her to not challenge, right? A lot of our great achievements as humans have come from people challenging the system. Now, I'm a West is the best kind of guys, but so if you look at it specifically from a Western American perspective, we're going to throw a tea party, right? We're going to do a lot of these things and we're going to keep challenging it to, the culmination of a lot of the stuff in the 60s, right? Hey, we're challenging it. I'm not getting off the bus, right? We're going to march on Washington in good ways, right? Now, respect. We don't burn things down. We don't do any of this other stuff, right? But respectfully engage the system, disagree, and respect who's on the other side of the table so we can come to some sort of consensus, right? I love, was it Stranger Things says, we need to come to compromise. Everybody's half happy.
Yeah.
Right? Like you need to be half happy. I need to be half happy. Because if I'm completely happy, I'm probably wrong.
Well, the idea of differing viewpoints, which is the whole point of this
Right.
podcast, differing viewpoints and being more civil in how we express our differences.
Mm-hmm.
But the beauty of debate is that you test ideas to failure.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with modern society is we're just sitting here slinging sound bites.
And we've got to stop testing our ideas on echo chambers. This is going to prop you up because you said the right soundbite.
Yeah.
Right? If I throw a soundbite at you that's outside of my echo chamber, that's the wrong soundbite, you'd laugh at me. And I would feel shame, as I should.
Define echo chamber.
Echo chamber is where you find a bunch of people, it could be in your neighborhood, it could be on a social media platform that think just like you. So we live in Denver, Broncos are our football team, NFL team. If I find a bunch of diehard Bronco fans and I say, the Broncos are the best. Yes, they are.
Okay.
Yes. Right.
You've got
That's
your
an
echo chamber.
Right.
Got it.
Now,
Got
if somebody were walking to that room and be like, guys, since Boland's declined, our team sucked. What do you mean? No, that's not the case. You need that person. Now, if you come in and say at the same time of a room where everybody's like, the Broncos are a mediocre team. I love them. I've always been here. We have problems. And somebody's like, they're the best. We are. You're an idiot. How could you claim we're the best? There's no evidence to support your opinion at all, right? The stadium isn't filling up. The TV ratings are down. The wins are down. We haven't made the postseason. You can go back and that person like, oh, if he just wants to run back to his best crowd, that's him running to the echo chamber. I think we need to specifically look for people outside of what makes us feel good. Look for people that think and believe differently than us, but also respect us, that care for us, and throw some of these ideas out, and you'll quickly learn which one of your ideas are immature, because we all have them. We all have really immature sound bites that we hold on to. And the second one of those gets blown up, you're like, oh, okay, I need to nuance this.
That's because your stable datum just got eliminated.
Right.
Yanked out from under.
Like go talk trickle down economics with people that don't believe it and don't believe it for good reason. Get ripped apart. And then you'll also say, well, there's pieces of where trickle down economics don't appear to work. And there's pieces where it clearly does work.
Agreed.
Right. But if you just say, no, a rising tide always raises all ships. It's like, it kind of blows some up while it's doing it. I mean, in that kind of, but that's not to say that your premise is wrong. You have to redefine it and then move that viewpoint a little bit. And that's what's fun about these things. Like you think of the different people you've had on this podcast, right? From Caitlin, your youngest.
Yeah, a few months back, some of our viewers will recall that we had my youngest daughter on, and that we track the statistics on how many people listen to the podcast. that one was near the top. People
Yeah.
loved that episode.
Right. And I think it's because also, you did a good job of coming alongside her where you agree with her. Um, she sits in a very unique lived experience from being in close proximity to some very traumatic events. She's seems like weighing out all the woke issues and coming to her conclusions on them. And then you've had the Rev on,
Yeah,
right?
the Reverend Leon Kelly.
Yeah, and that's just a wild story.
Yeah.
Right? Right.
Yeah.
And then you've had Tarani, right? Like how those are all very different life experiences
Sure.
with very specific viewpoints. Tarani it was interesting. Like when you started talking about national security and the border, like something in his voice happened. You could tell.
Well,
He's worried.
He's been there and done that.
Yeah, he's worried because of his experience, and he knows that that's in his estimation and his viewpoint. That's a huge problem, right? Your daughter, with her, what she's experienced, there's certain issues that she's very touchy about, rightfully so, right? But you listen to all these, you wrestle with all of these, you facilitate all of these things, and I think that I don't know. I guess I hope that that's a way to make society better. Hope to walk back some of the places we've clearly gone off the rails on this thing.
Well, if you want to, we're running out of time now. We
Mhm.
should bring this to a
You don't want to go
close.
for 3 more hours?
Well, it's always interesting to talk to you. I have things I have to do today, and
Yeah.
you do too.
Yes,
But
sir.
and also the audience probably
So
wants a
they probably
break.
already turned it off, but yeah.
But well, I wouldn't presume that, that given our statistics. But the concept is, if you want to destroy the free will of a society, you disarm that society. And if you believe in the value of having an armed population, how about this idea? Forget about guns for a little bit
Mhm.
and arm yourself with education.
Absolutely.
Your mind is your greatest weapon. That's what Steve Tarani taught us.
Absolutely.
So arm yourself. At least educate yourself and arm yourself with your greatest weapon, your mind.
Okay, so give us a 3 or 4 or 5 step process on how to do that. And let's say you're talking to a 33-year-old professional, still the first third of their career. How do they educate themselves?
First of all, stop wasting your time on things that don't educate you, but instead program you. You don't need to be programmed. You need to be educated, and there's a difference. Start identifying quality materials that you can expose yourself to regularly that will enrich you rather than stir you up or program you or shut your brain down. Start to be aware of the difference and seek out the quality material and spend time with that and stay off of the stupid stuff. So that's Godfrey's tip. Stay off the stupid stuff.
Absolutely. That needs to be on a placard over a bathroom stall or something.
Well,
right?
a famous gun instructor, Ken Hackathorn, used to say, "Don't do stupid shit." That was his repeated mantra as a gun instructor.
Yeah.
Don't do stupid shit. And,
Yeah.
and he became famous for it. And it's kind of endearing because Ken is such a wonderful guy. But I think the idea should be, how do I make myself better? And is this activity doing that? Why am I doing this? Whether it's surfing Twitter or reading a treatise about the Federalist Papers. And that's still fresh material, by the way. The Federalist Papers should be reread today by every American.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, that's
I can't do that. I'm too busy on Angry Birds.
Yeah, or the society that we don't have time, and binge watching is a commonly used term.
Yeah.
And again, I think that we need our leisure, right? We live
Sure.
in a very blessed time where we have a lot of leisure.
Watch. I'm halfway through in the last 3 days. I'm halfway through Under the Dome.
Okay, yeah. Yeah.
Fun show.
Yeah, I know.
Nothing wrong with that at night.
So being I fashion myself as, at the end of the day, I'm a storyteller. And so in order to get better at that craft, I started watching a lot of narrative. And then I took stock. I'm watching probably like 15, 18 hours of narrative a week. And this is before I had kids. This is a problem.
And that's because you're curious about the world and you don't waste your time.
Well, I think I got to a point where I got too far on it. So then I switched to lectures on YouTube. And oh my gosh, my world blew up. right?
TED Talks, baby.
Right. TED Talks. And even like that is almost like that's just the gateway drug to it, right?
Yeah.
There are lectures, like literally lectures from college classrooms, from subject matter experts on anything you want out there, right? You want to go learn particle physics? Listen to it. I didn't understand any of it, but expose my brain, right?
I've dug into that. There's tons of stuff.
Right. Just go start listening to something. It's funny, like I hardly watch any narrative anymore. I love listening to either lectures. I've really grown. A lot of people do audiobooks. I like lectures a little bit more because it's even a little bit less polished, right? Because if somebody, the lecture is still gonna be authoritative. It's still gonna be great, but it's still somebody talking, and you can read their eyes and see their body language while they're delivering this lecture. As where an audiobook, that's still a very highly, highly polished process. And those, I'm not throwing any shade. I still think those are great tools, but I guess find your flavor is what I'm ultimately getting to. If you want to do audiobooks, do audiobooks. If you want to do lectures. Let's make a commitment to showing up and learning, right? And if we do that consistently over time as a society, we're going to end up in a great spot.
Agreed. Well, on that note, it's time to sign off.
Yes, sir.
I'm Brett Godfrey. This is ViewPoint. Thank you for tuning in.
Awesome. That was fun.
It was.
Went all over the map. That was fun.
Very fun.
Very fun.